So we'd like to welcome you tonight to the session on October the 31st. And we are speaking with Kathryn and Edwin Humphries about Ruth and Malcolm Sale, a remarkable couple who became Baha'is in the 1950s. And I happen to know them through my childhood and youth and through the years as well. So looking forward to hearing Edwin and Kathy speak. Now, Kathy, of course, had been part of that family as one of the daughters of the Sales, and Edwin became a Baha'i in 1975 at Yarrambul, and he and Kathy married in 1976, and they're going to speak not only about Ruth and Malcolm Sale, but also the subsequent generations, and I understand quite a number of offspring with us tonight. I hand over to you, Kathryn and Edwin, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Graham. We've got a few photos of you too in there when you're a little boy, so keep your eyes open. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to read this because I think it flows better. So this is the story of my parents, Ruth and Malcolm Sale, finding and becoming Baha'is in 1956 and their life as Baha'is. My mother, Ruth Stevens, was born into a family of 6 children in Manly, Sydney, on the 14th of May, 1918. She was a very outgoing and personable character, being the organiser of many teaching activities wherever she went. She came from a long line of Christian ministers and was brought up as a Presbyterian. She boasted that one of our ancestors was a pirate, just to balance out the minister story. She was convinced we did, so we believed her. Mum was born during the First World War and lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War. During the war, she worked as a company secretary and did personnel training, moving to Melbourne to work. She tells of her mother during the Depression making an extra sandwich every day for her father to take and place near the rubbish bins that starving people went through to find food. He was fortunate in that he had a job as an accountant with a shipping company and travelled on the Manly ferries to work in the city. My father, Malcolm Owen Sale, was born in Canterbury, Sydney, on the 7th of March, 1916. He was a Methodist. He, like Mum, felt it was time for the return of Christ, as Christianity had reached every country on earth as promised. He worked in engineering and quality assessment. He loved the faith and was a great supporter of Mum in her Baha'i activities and served on many committees and assemblies. They loved in particular the concept of the faith, the unity of God, the unity of religions, and the oneness of mankind. They also felt that one of the 12 Baha'i principles, the equality of men and women, was very timely. Mum was a great advocate of this teaching and had to battle for equality in many aspects of her own life. During the war, Dad was exempted from military service to work in his family business, AV Sale Engineering, which made propellers and other components for military vessels. They were introduced by friends shortly after the war, whilst Mum was still living and working in Melbourne. Dad used to fly down to Melbourne periodically to see her, and on one of these trips proposed to her. According to Mum, he said, "Will you marry me? I can cook an Irish stew." She thought, "I'll never get another offer like that," and said yes. Ruth and Malcolm lived the first 9 years of their married life in the Sutherland Shire, New South Wales, where they found the Baha'i faith. They had 4 children, Susan, myself, Brian, and Timothy. Susan has since passed away. I'm living in Kiama, and Brian and Tim are back in the Sutherland Shire, as is one of our daughters, Bahia, and 3 of our grandchildren, where Mum and Dad first began their Baha'i journey. This is the house they were living in on the Esplanade in Cronulla in Sutherland, where they found the Baha'i faith in 1956. My brother Brian was only a few months old, and my sister and I were 7 and 5. Having witnessed many of their friends being killed during the war and the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, left them wondering what sort of a world they had brought us into. They investigated many religions but couldn't find any to satisfy their quest. After fervent prayers for spiritual guidance, Mum found herself on the edge of a cliff calling out, "If there is a God, please show me." That same night, Dad came home from work after visiting the local library, where he found the book Baha'u'llah and the New Era on the Traymobil, ready to be put back on the shelves. After having read it, they contacted the local Baha'is, read multiple Baha'i books, attended firesides, and declared within 2 weeks on Baha'u'llah's birthday, on the 12th of November 1956, halfway through the 10-year World Crusade. Soon after their declaration, the minister of Cronulla Presbyterian Church visited our home to invite Susan and myself to join them at Sunday school. Mum declined and told him that we had become Baha'is. He asked for a Bible and pointed out the writings warning of false prophets and invited Mum to a church service. She attended, and after the service, he invited all present to become members and to stay for Holy Communion. Mum arose from the very front seat and walked the full length of the aisle, clattering on the tile floor, and was the only person to leave, and as she put it, conspicuously. Only a few months after joining the faith, they had the sad and unbelievable news of the Guardian's death in London on November the 4th, 1957. Having declared during the 10-year World Crusade, which went from 1953 to 1963, there were still many goals to be formed by 1963. As part of that World Crusade, Shoghi Effendi asked that 30 assemblies be formed during that time throughout Australia. Municipal boundaries needed to be reformed for LSAs to be established. Peter Khan was the secretary of the National Teaching Committee at the time and had recently travelled to Perth to assess the situation over there. Mum and Dad were afire with the faith and asked where they could serve. Peter suggested they go to consolidate with the Friends there at least the restoration of the Perth LSA by 1963, coinciding with the end of the 10-year crusade, the 100th anniversary of the declaration of Baha'u'llah, and the election of the first Universal House of Justice. Before leaving for Perth in July, Ruth and Malcolm decided to stay for 2 conferences, one being the Intercontinental Conference in Sydney from the 21st to the 24th of March in 1958. Mother Dunn was among those who addressed the conference, at which Baha'is from 17 countries gathered. 5 hands of the cause who are circled is Mother Dunn, Charles Mason Remy, who was the appointed representative of the Guardian, Zikrullah Khadem, Agnes Alexander, and Collis Featherston were the 5 hands of the cause. Baha'is from 17 countries gathered, including Iran, Pakistan, South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, the New Hebrides, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands, Samoa, the Cook Islands, Fiji, New Zealand, Formosa, and the United States. You can see photos of a lot of the Baha'i Friends who, though little as Bruce there with his babies, and we're down the front there as children. Oh, okay, so in this photo of some of the friends from the conference, some of the friends of the conference with Mum and Dad and Brother Brian during that time. Among them, a hand of the cause, Agnes Alexander from Japan, Bill Smits, Knight of Baha'u'llah, the Knight of Baha'u'llah in South Korea, Michitoshi Zenimoto from Japan, Frank and Bibi Khan, Peter Khan's parents, and Hamlin Walker, John Walker's father. On the second day of the conference, Mother Dunn laid the foundation stone of the Sydney Temple, placing a small casket with soil from the sacred shrine of Baha'u'llah and some plaster from the Bab cell in the prison of Maku, in the ground beneath what is now the centre of the main auditorium. She was fortunate enough to see the finished building, including the small lantern on the top of the dome, which was lifted into place by a helicopter 6 months before she passed away on the 18th of November 1960. The house of worship was dedicated a year later in 1961. We have a children's prayer book that Mother Dunn signed for us at that conference, and also some hand-tinted photos of Abdul Baha and Bahia Khanum that Effie Baker gave to us. 3 months after the Intercontinental Conference, Malcolm and Ruth had sold up their home, Dad given up his job, and they packed their 3 children into the car and caravan. On July the 2nd, 1958, they set off on a 6-week travel teaching journey to Perth, visiting isolated believers along the way. I remember Dad saying that in one way he felt a little crazy. You went too fast. Sorry, Edwin's flicked it over. I remember Dad saying that in one way he felt a little crazy, giving up everything he knew and travelling across the continent to an unknown destination with little money, a young family and no job to go to. He took comfort in knowing the sacrifices that the Dunns had made in leaving everything and travelling in poverty across the world to a virtually unknown destination. My own reflection on this is the parallel story of many of the Persian friends who were forced to do the same thing some years later, during and after the revolution in 1979. The trip to Perth took us first down into the Illawarra to say goodbye to the Khans and going to see the blowhole in Kiama, where we now live. Then to visit some of the friends at a winter school at Yarranbull, then on and down to Albury and into Victoria. We were not the only travellers on the way, as you can see. They weren't Baha'is. Included in this trip was a 3-day stay at Finley with Bill and Jean Johnson and family, an unexpected arrival at the Bahai Conference in Ballarat, where they met the Handley family, Effie Baker, the Bose family, Margaret Rowling, Emily Easy, and others. In Adelaide, they met and stayed at the home of the Featherston family for a week. We had some unusual interactions on the trip and visited isolated believers along the way. I don't know the names of all these isolated believers, but some people might like to add to it if they know. So yes, this is how we used to camp on the road at night. And here we're looking at part of the Great Australian Bight. This was the South Australia-West Australian border marker. And we were trying to read bits and pieces on it today. There's some advertising and somebody's lost shoe and a balloon. After the long haul across the Nullarbor, we arrived in Perth on August the 14th, 1958, where we were to spend the next 6.5 years. Nullarbor means no trees. Ottilie Strempel, who's standing up, was a very special and important soul, many times saving us from hunger when Dad was out of work. She seemed to instinctively know when things were tight and just turned up with food. She lectured in the Teachers' College adjoining the East Claremont Primary Demonstration School, where Sue and I went. Our particular classroom was modelled on a country school with about 20 students. The rest of the school was like a normal city school setup. Teachers' College students would come and practice on us. We had done homeschooling on the caravan trip across the desert and had fallen behind other students. Ottilie had recommended that we go to this particular classroom setup as it would give us a better chance of adjusting to the new curriculum and catching up with subjects that we had lagged behind in. There were, of course, many Bahai community gatherings in Perth, and I don't know the names of some of these people. It's going to take a long time to point out different people, but you'll recognise some. We had the privilege of meeting with Hand of the Cause Enoch Alinga in 1958. This photo we only just found a couple of days ago. And I realized that it's my father's father is in the far left-hand corner next to Enoch. And he was actually visiting us at the time. And I didn't realize until I saw this photo that he must have come to the airport to meet with Enoch Olinga and Collis Featherston, who were on their way, I think, to various conferences around the world. And Sue's at the front here, and I'm in between Collis and Enoch, and Otley Stremple on the far side, on the far right-hand side. Every Saturday, we're all put to work cleaning the house. So this is two of the houses that we lived in. So we're put to work cleaning the house and cooking special food for our weekly firesides. I remember we had an electric polisher that we children used to polish all the floorboards with in the house. Every room in the house had to be meticulously cleaned. Various Baha'is came and would give wonderful talks on the faith. Other memories were that we children used to fall asleep behind the lounge during meetings, as we didn't have anyone to mind us at home. Late at night, I remember Dad hauling us up on his shoulders and taking us to the car to be transported to our warm beds. One year, my parents, feeling sorry for us, provided us with a Christmas tree. Being a very hot night, we left the outside doors open for cooling. In the morning, we woke up excitedly, only to find no presents. Someone had come in during the night and stolen them. At that time, there were reports of a murderer loose in our area with children about the same age as us, and the police thought it may have been him. The newspapers got wind of it and wanted to do an article with a photo of us sitting around the tree looking devastated. My mother was embarrassed when we were being asked to sit sadly under a Christmas tree for a photograph. When word got out, we were inundated with gifts from people of different religions, including our Jewish friends who owned several shoe stores and replaced the thongs that we had been given with ones of much better quality. As a result, though, we did get to teach the faith in areas that we wouldn't have otherwise reached. Here's a nice one of Bryn and Tony Deemer. Oh, sorry, haven't got to there yet. This is Meg. In those days, there were so few Baha'is in Australia that everyone knew everyone else. It was quite special. Meg Deemer became a Baha'i during that time in Perth, and of course her wonderful sons, Tony and Bryn, became very special Baha'is, serving the faith in the Holy Land and pioneering to Vanuatu. We used to play together as children. This is a lovely photo I only recently came across of Meg Deemer, Otley Stremple and my mother looking out over Perth. Dear Bryn sent me a photo of himself and Tony from those days. They were about the same age as Sue and I were. In August 1960, we had the special blessing of my brother Tim being born. He brought great delight to us all, and I think was a fresh breeze that helped lift my parents' spirits to keep on going. Dad had found it difficult to find steady work while we were in Perth, and Mum had taken up some secretarial work while Tim was still a baby. Her very kind boss allowed her to take Tim to work with her. Somehow we all managed. Dad's father, my mother's mother, Greta and Orr Blake from Sutherland, were some of the visitors who came all the way from Sydney to visit, some by plane and others by ship. On the right here is Rohinton Nuriestan, who lived with our family for some time while studying in Perth. He was one of the members of the reformed Perth Assembly. This is a newspaper photo of Susan and myself welcoming Ruhia Khanum at Perth Airport on her way to Sydney to dedicate the temple in 1961. The Perth Assembly was re-established on April the 21st, 1962, and South Perth Group of 6, filling the goal of the formation of the Perth Assembly before the end of the plan. So in the back row, left to right, is John Handley, who had married Margaret Featherston and moved to Perth. Margaret was 20 at the time. She's been very kind and filled in a few gaps for me. She was 20 at the time, so wasn't old enough to be elected to the Assembly. Kay Featherston is in the, oh no, we're going still along there. Kay Featherston, Betty Bunny and Harold Norfer are in the middle row, are in the back row still. And in the middle row, Ethel Bennett, Ottilie Stremple and Ruth Sale. And in the front row, Malcolm, my father, and Rohinton Nuriez Dunn. Dad had found it really hard to get work, and they decided that they should return to Sydney. They'd achieved the goals of the 10-year crusade, and other Baha'is had come across the desert, or they'd be declared themselves as Baha'is. So Mum and Dad felt it was probably better to go back and try and get some regular work so that we could keep the family going. So in 1965, we all returned by train across the Nullarbor back to Sydney. On returning to Sydney, Mum and Dad always moved into home front pioneering areas, Rockdale being the area at the time. Dad fortunately got work in the engineering field, and Mum worked for several years at the Bahai National Office in Paddington as Peter de Vogel's secretary. They served on several assemblies and Bahai committees, and the women in our family were members of the first Bahai Temple Choir, all of whom were female. Men later joined to enrich the singing. Here you are, Graham, you're in here somewhere.
And David's online as well.
Yeah?
Yeah.
These are shots of what we think was a Holy Day celebration at what we think was at the Hassels. And they're really well-known faces, but I'm not very good at remembering the names. So in this photo, as Mum, Brian, Tim, Sue, I'm right up the back, and then there's Joe and Lorna Salter with their youngest daughter, Ione, who married Paul Blewett. Fred Grant on the far left, he was a wonderful man, and Roland Biles, who's over on the right just behind Sue. And they're the only ones I remember. That lady right at the front was very well known, but I can't remember her name. So this is a photo of the home in Rockdale where we lived when we got back from Perth. It was the hub of many Bahai activities. There were several generations of residents. First Mum and Dad and the family, then Edwin and myself, then Tim with Darwin Price. It was very, very close to Sydney Airport, so we had the pleasure of picking up and hosting many overseas Baha'is who arrived in Australia. Mum and Dad encouraged us children to join the Dawnbreakers, which was a singing group and travel teaching team formed when the Baha'is Russ and Gina Garcia sailed into Sydney in their catamaran in December 1967, intending to stay for 1 week, a week that turned into months. Russ was a well-known Hollywood music composer. That's him on the far left. Russ was a well-known Hollywood music composer, preparing scores for well-known television shows such as The Virginian, Laredo, The Time Tunnel, and The Wild Wild West. He created musical firesides where he would sing a song, where we would all sing a song, and then members of the group would step forward and give a small speech about one of the aspects of the faith. We toured through New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and visited Brisbane for a performance. While in Australia, the ABC offered Russ work, you have to go back a bit, and he completed musical arrangements for their special Christmas show that went to Vietnam to entertain the troops during the Vietnam War. So here's the Dawnbreakers group with Tony Vojkovic, who wasn't in the last photo. He's on the third from the left. Oh, we're passing this one by. Oh, do you want me to read? Oh, there's an article in the Wagga Wagga Daily Advertiser in 1968. Sorry, I'm looking at my photo ahead. So Edwin, I didn't want him to put this in, but he did. So we kept going. Okay, so here are some of the members of the early Temple Choir, plus others singing at a meeting. So it wasn't an official choir song, but Sue's up the back and Gina Garcia and Jenny Heggie and a lot of them. Oh, Merle Heggie right up at the far right-hand corner. And Chris, Tanya, there's your dad, right here in the front. There were many very Mum and Dad were very supportive of me when my daughter Jamila was born, and in the years following our other children, they were supportive of me with all of those. They were also wonderful with Sue and Brian and Tim and all of the grandchildren. Okay. In 1974, Mum and Dad went on Bahai pilgrimage, but unlike pilgrims of today, they were very fortunate to be able to visit the Bahai holy places in Iran. I've only just found reference of them visiting the home of them visiting the home where Baha'u'llah spent his childhood. It is now completely destroyed, but Mum wrote this in her pilgrim notes at the time. And I really wanted to read this because I didn't realize that she even went there until I'd pulled out a book that I thought she'd done all in shorthand, but she's done a lot of it in longhand, so I could actually read it. So I'm just going to read exactly what she had as a note in her book. So she said, a Persian friend took us to see the house of Baha'u'llah. We drove a long distance to the old section south of Tehran and parked the car about a quarter of a mile from the house of Baha'u'llah. Then walked in single file through the narrow alleyway, past pedestrians and children playing games, and little food and shoe shops. Eventually, after many twists and turns in the alleys, we stopped at a gate in a high wall. Our Bahai guide took out a key and unlocked the gate, and we beheld a beautiful courtyard and garden, rectangular in shape and quite large. There were about 3 very large trees and a pond surrounded by rose gardens. We were led to a building on the right and directed to remove our shoes outside the door, which admitted us to an antechamber. Persian carpets, a lounge, and cabinets with photos of the Holy Family were in this room. A quiet, gentle Persian lady greeted us effusively, and on our exit from the chamber, Baha'u'llah offered us sweets and rose petals from the garden. We prostrated ourselves in prayer at the steps leading to a second room, crossed the room, and again prostrated ourselves at the door entering Baha'u'llah's room. The room was very large and all rooms covered in beautiful Persian rugs, and in Baha'u'llah's room was a beautiful chandelier, no furniture, a peaceful and happy atmosphere, and were left and alone to pray. Our guide then connected an electric light bulb to a long lead, as it was now dark, and led us to an inside courtyard, down winding steps and into underground rooms, constituting a vast bathing area, with baths sunken into the ground and various dressing rooms adjoining them through an immense kitchen and storeroom area, where we saw large ovens and cool rooms for storing food. We then were shown carpeted bedrooms of Baha'u'llah's mother and sister, and saw above the courtyard a black starry sky and crescent moon shining down on us, and above us a parapet, which I visualized had been used by Baha'u'llah in his prayers to the Almighty. This whole property gave the impression of having been both a mansion and a happy childhood home, and I left it wondering how difficult Baha'u'llah must have found renouncing his worldly comforts for his life of exile and suffering. What heartbreak his family must have experienced at the persecution, ridicule, and separation they had to encounter from the very neighbors they had grown up with. It was with feelings of awe, respect, love, and sorrow that we left this beautiful home, farewelled by embraces from our humble Persian hostess. The next day we saw Mr. Samandari, who arranged our trip to Shiraz to visit the house of the Bab. We met Mr. Akbar, who drove us to the house of the Bab, picking up Mr. Afnan, who was a descendant of the Bab, and who presented us with pink roses of a perfume more potent than I had ever smelt. He said, "These are roses from the city of roses and nightingales. You are the nightingales." We have many stories of friends who have visited the house of the Barb, so I won't relate this one due to shortness of time. This is us outside 3 Eve Street in Rockdale when Sue was visiting with her 2 older children. Tanya is with us tonight. Not quite sure where this was, but it was in 1975, somewhere in Sydney. Many recognisable faces here. After returning from Perth, when she was working, Mum had slowly paid off 2 blocks of land with her child endowment money. 1 block at Yarranbull, near the Bahai School, and 1 in the Shoalhaven area. They decided to put them both on the market near retirement with the intention of spending the rest of their lives either helping out at the Bahai School or helping fill the goal of establishing an assembly in the Shoalhaven area. That's just down from Wollongong, a couple of hours. The income from the sale of one of the blocks would pay for the building of a home on the other. So this is what they did. And as it turned out, the Yarranbull block sold first. And so they used the money from that to build a house on the block in Shoalhaven area and help build the assembly there. Mum had a particular affinity for Aboriginal people and throughout her life sought to help and teach them. Burnham, who most of you know, Harry Penrith, and his family were close friends. He gave talks on the faith and the Aboriginal Dreamtime to the elders down in the Aboriginal Centre in Nowra. This photo was taken in that centre where he is telling a story with children from the Kiama community, including our daughter Annalise and Venus Rahmani, whom most of you know. Mum had a particular affinity, we did that one. With other Baha'is, they helped re-establish the LSA of the Baha'is of that area. So this is the assembly plus the children, including Mum and Dad, John and Fahime Walker, Mr. and Mrs. Leatherbarrow, Pauline Mason, many of you would know her as, plus others. And I haven't got all the names of all the members there either. I have to find them. A lot of teaching happened, particularly in the Aboriginal community and among the Aboriginal elders. My mother was heavily involved and some of the elders attended her funeral. Teaching teams were brought down from Sydney with wonderful multicultural performers, including Islander dancing teams who performed at the Aboriginal Centre in Nowra. In 1987, Edwin and I and our family were asked by the National Spiritual Assembly to take on the full-time caretaking job at Yarranbull. We did this, but Edwin also needed to take on a full-time job in Mittagong. Mum and Dad were particularly helpful, coming up especially during the school holidays to allow me to continue caretaking and running of the school while still looking after our 5 children. Our youngest son, Ruhi, was born while we served here. I would like to give recognition to my wonderful sister, Susan, who passed away in 1997 at the age of 47 from cancer. She worked tirelessly for the faith, being a member of the First Temple Choir, secretary to NSA member Jim Heggie, pioneering to New Zealand, Alice Springs, Nimbin and Warwick. Sue was always an active Bahai and frequently a secretary. She also did a lot of Bahai community radio. In 1993, before passing, Sue moved into Shoalhaven to be near my parents and assist with the Bahai community activities there. She has 4 wonderful children and 6 grandchildren, some of who have joined us tonight. This is Sue's. Okay. Sue's death deeply affected Mum and her health started declining. For a time, Malcolm, Dad, was able to cope as her carer, but in 2000 they moved to Mayflower Retirement Village in Kiama, which is part of Kiama Community, where we live, to be near our family for additional support. A few months later, she was admitted to hospital and passed away on February the 15th, 2001. Shortly after, in 2001, Dad moved in with us and was elected to the Kiama Local Assembly. He participated in the many activities of the local community and joined the senior citizens group. He remained fairly healthy, giving the grandchildren driving lessons, taking long walks, mowing our lawn until the last few months, where he passed away 10 years after Mum, after a short illness, and he died on July the 4th, 2011, at the age of 93. So they're all, the three, Susan, Mum and Dad are all buried in Shoalhaven Cemetery. And that's that.
And this is where I might take over with kind of the Humphries history. I came into the faith because my brother Nicholas and his then girlfriend Lynn had become Baha'is. This was in 1974. They'd attended a seminar run by Aaron and Nola Blomley on the equality of men and women and thought that was a pretty good idea. And they started going along to firesides. And on Christmas Day, 1974, they became Baha'is. And the following day, he said to my mother and I, "Do you want to come along and find out about this faith that I've joined?" We were living in Barrel, which is quite close to Yirrumbil, and there was, of course, a summer school on at the time. I'd pretty much lost faith in religion generally, having been brought up a Catholic. So I said, okay, I'll come along, but I'm going to bring my own car because I might want to leave early. So my mother and Nicholas left at 9. I stayed till 11 talking to this guy, Terry Spratt, about all sorts of things. Started telling me about all the Baha'i teachings, equality of men and women and world peace and abolition of prejudice. And my response was, yeah, I get that. And then we talked about more spiritual subjects and so on. So I left at 11 o'clock and came back the following evening, and then the evening after that, and then over the weekend. I was talking to people like Scott Stafford and Melanie Price, John Walker, Howard Harwood. And on the 29th of December, I was told I couldn't come back the following day because it was a feast, and only Baha'is could attend feasts. And I thought about it, and so I turned up the following day and asked Fawad Fagani for a declaration card, signed it and gave it back to him. Immediately I was given this enormous bear hug by a rather tall, dark gentleman from America who I don't know. I lived in Barrel at the time and there weren't any Baha'is there, but this guy lived in the adjoining community in Moss Vale, Aaron Blomley, and that was pretty much on my way to and from work. So I became a regular visitor at their house and had a, if you like, a sort of a kitchen table Baha'i upbringing, talking to Aaron and Nola and of course the kids, and getting a thorough grounding in what it is to be a Baha'i. And in Aaron's description, what it is to be a Baha'i is to be of service. And so one of my early projects was to help lay the foundations to that building, the now no longer children's room at Yirrumbil, with Aaron and the architect, Rob Chaffee, and this guy who some of you will know, Barry O'Brien. In that first year as a Baha'i, I went to the winter school at Yirrumbil and on a teaching trip, first to Griffith to see my brother who'd pioneered to Griffith by that time, and meet some of the local community, to Tumut to meet Don and Mary Jo Darby, to Ballarat to stay with this guy, Les Andre, and on to Melbourne to stay with this guy, Steve Sexton. By the end of that year, I was getting tired of driving from Barrel to Sydney every weekend to attend youth activities. So I decided I'd move to Sydney, get a job, which I did. On the way there, I went from Barrel to Sydney via Brisbane. It was the Brisbane Baha'i Youth Conference. Many of the people there are probably tuned in today, and hello to all of you. And after the Brisbane Youth Conference, I, with Bryn Deemer, moved into a flat in Hunters Hill, and in that building. But I'd met somebody at the Brisbane Youth Conference, and she was pretty good, pretty neat. And so I thought, okay. We went out for a first date on Valentine's Day. Nothing significant there, I don't think. But I quickly realised that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with this woman. So we decided to get married. Ruth and Malcolm gave their consent pretty quickly. I rashly asked my mother the first time that she met Kathy that I asked for consent. She was Dutch, and her response was "Gaweg," which in the context could be roughly interpreted as "don't be bloody stupid." But Kathy won her around over a few months, and we got their consent. And so we duly got married by John Stevenson. I found it was Father's Day, and suddenly not only was I a husband, but a father as well, which was rather interesting. And we were married in the backyard of Jürgen and Ferry Voigtman's house in Ryde. It turned out to be a bit of a social occasion. We invited 60 people and 90 turned up. You'll recognise some of these faces, I'm sure. A month later, there was a teaching conference. I think it was in Maitland. And speaking at that teaching conference was this guy, Janabi Caldwell. He was a Bahai from Alaska, a well-known and enthusiastic teacher of the faith. And he was speaking, giving a session at this conference, and halfway through the session, I had this sudden, overwhelming conviction that I needed to go pioneering, and along with that came the practical realization that here I was, married a month, new wife, new stepdaughter who really wasn't used to me yet, and vice versa. And how was all that going to work? And so I went out in the car, left the second halfway through, went out and sat in my car and started saying prayers. At the end of the session, Kathy came out to the car and hopped in and said, "I've got something to say to you." And I said, "So have I." And she said, "I want to go pioneering." So we took that as an omen. It was the middle of the first 5-year plan. And so we started looking at the pioneering goals. I'm an industrial chemist, and so we were looking at places where there was some level of chemical industry where I could get employment. So Philippines, Sri Lanka, East Africa, these were all goals, and we tried them all. And every time we tried one, the doors would sort of shut in our faces, and we were having very little success at trying to find where to settle, to travel. So we wrote to the Universal House of Justice explaining our dilemma and saying, could you please advise us on what our options are? And we received a letter back from the House of Justice, which literally said, thank you for volunteering to pioneer to Tonga. Tonga had never appeared in our picture of where we could possibly go, because I didn't anticipate there was going to be a lot of industry there. And again, we took that as an omen and we left. We went by boat, by cruise boat, much to the consternation of the crew, because we arrived with a party of porters carrying our luggage. Most people just came with a suitcase. We came with 3 cubic meters of luggage, because that's what in those days you were permitted to take on a boat. And we were, I mean, obviously we were going pioneering. We were going to live there, and so we took all our goods and chattels. They have no idea where to put the stuff. Anyway, it was quite a restful trip for us. After the hectic nature of the preparation. This was the boat that we sailed in on, and that that's the first view we got. We came in pretty much at dawn, so that's the first view we got of Nuku'alofa, the capital city of Tonga, and that was where we settled. We were met by some of the Baha'is, and we were taken to one of the local motels for a few days. It had some rather distinctive decorations, and yeah, there's Jamila sitting on the bed. Shortly afterwards, we were brought into the house of Masese Hokafonu, who was the auxiliary board member at the time, and stayed with him for several weeks, with him and his family. And then he and his family moved to their village house, leaving us to rent his house in Nuku'alofa. Left us with some family retainers and itinerant visitors. We got to know some of the other pioneers. Some of you will know this man, Grenville Curtin, a wonderful guy, really such a strong supporter to us over the time. We also met Stephen Mashiko Garrigas, who were pioneers from America, and Jamila became quite close to their children. And another American pioneer, Jeff Hoagland, who all the locals knew as Cepho. And he was an interesting character as well. We'll see in a moment some of his handiwork. Kathy instantly got a job at the National Office, which was right next door to the house that we lived in, as executive assistant to the National Secretary. And I was asked to take care of the bookshop, which was located behind this building, which is the hall at the National Centre at the time. I assume it's developed a little since then. Kathy was also appointed to the National Teaching Committee, which Tonga at the time had actually slipped backwards in achieving the goals assigned to it by the Universal House of Justice. And so being on the National Teaching Committee was quite a challenge. Fairly early on, though, we attended, or we saw a Bahai stall at the Tonga annual show. And this had been put together, all the artwork had been put together by that American pioneer, Cepho, and it was absolutely beautiful, with the 12 principles, progressive revelation, and a Baha'i quotation. But what became very, very clear was that the Tongans were extraordinarily good teachers throughout the entire days of the show. Every time we visited, we would see this kind of throng at the stall, people 2 and 3 deep, listening to what was being said by the Baha'is in the stall. And as I said, it became clear that the Baha'is were very, very good teachers, but because of a lack of planning, probably more than anything else, they had sort of, the teaching work had faltered in a structured sense. At that stage, I was also appointed to the National Teaching Committee, and with the help of the Tongan members, we put together a teaching plan, because we were more than halfway through the 5-year plan and had slipped behind from the beginning. We thought that we needed to galvanize the community, and so we put the targets at higher than those that had been assigned by the Universal House of Justice. And the plan was duly accepted by the National Assembly and implemented. By the end of the plan, that actually achieved all of the goals of our National Teaching Plan, and many and more besides. So they overachieved the overachieving plan. This was a day. This was actually our first wedding anniversary, and we thought we'd go to the International Dateline Hotel, the sort of premium hotel, for one night, so that we could at least have a hot shower. And it turned out that the hot water system wasn't working in the hotel. So all we got was a trickle down the shower wall. That was better than the cold showers we were experiencing. Shortly after this, Kathy became sick with morning sickness, very seriously ill, so much so that ultimately she was admitted to hospital. And in the hospital, she heard the doctors discussing thalidomide. And obviously this was a bit of a concern, and because the doctors weren't communicating with us about what the treatments would be and so forth, we ended up deciding that we had to come back. And we wrote to the House of Justice, and they wrote back and said, thank you for letting us know. We're sure you will return to the pioneering field in the future. And so we packed up all our goods and chattels, sold what we could, like my record player and so on. And we came back by air. This is the group who came to the airport to see us off, and some of the particular friends that we'd made over that time. And we settled back with Kathy's mother and father in 3 Eve Street, Arncliffe. And we were there probably about 5 years in all. During that time, Bahia was born, and following that, Annalise was born. We wanted to, down the track a bit, we decided we wanted to buy a house, but obviously buying a house in the east, we weren't that comfortably off, so we needed to go out to the western suburbs, and we looked around, and we found that there was a goal town called Camden, and so we pioneered to Camden to help form the assembly there. That's the house we were in. And shortly thereafter, the first local assembly was formed with people that some of you may recognise: 3 Hasselhoons and 2 Leongs and 2 Sabetzades and 2 Humphries. And that community was also half children. And it was a wonderful community, did a lot of good work, and I sometimes look back and I think of it as a model of what a Bahai community can be. About 3 years after we moved to Camden, I was transferred to Queensland with my job. And so again, we found where we were needed was, and that turned out to be a place north of Brisbane called Caboolture. And so we rented a house there, and I started work, and we settled down. And about a year later, the people that we were renting the house from decided or told us that they needed us to move out because the house that we were in was about to be demolished, and they wanted to build a hardware store. So rather than that approach, we decided that we would buy the house, put it on the back of a truck, and put it on a new block of land. So this became our house. And it was in that house that we had a new addition to the house, to the family. That was Jalal. Yes, a sudden appearance. By this time it was 1986, and the Caboolture Local Assembly decided that we wanted to put on a peace festival. I'd been thrown out of a job by this time, so you get transferred interstate and then get thrown out of work. That's a great sequence. But because I had the time, the local assembly asked if I would effectively be the executive officer of the festival. So we don't have a lot of photos of it. I was a little too busy running it, but it consisted of a concert which featured George and Louetta Kako, some of you may remember, and there was an art exhibition and children's activities from the local school and so forth. Okay, so this plaque was put in, and it says, "These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come." And that garden had been has been, or the park has been extensively remodeled by Caboolture Council. So I was personally worried about whether the Peace Garden still remained, but yes, it did. This was a couple of years ago. That rock was what was put in by Peter Thompson from the Bahai Community, and the plaque's still there. We returned to Sydney shortly after that in order to get a job, and we were staying with Malcolm and Ruth down in Vincentia, trying to work out, where we would stay and all the rest of it. We were saying 9 tablets of Ahmad. And in the middle of it, we got a phone call from a friend of ours, Maureen Davies, who was at that stage on the school committee, saying, would you like to come up and be temporary caretakers at Yerrinbil, because the appointed caretakers can't take up their position just yet. We'd had to leave all our stuff in Queensland. So here we were given an offer of free accommodation in a fully furnished house with all amenities at no cost. And we kind of said, well, yes, of course. And subsequently, the National Assembly asked us to stay on for a full year, 3-year term. So we did. And then there was another addition to the family. Rui arrived. Kathy became heavily involved in children's activities, and I became involved in the local environment and giving sessions at schools on the local bush. Of course, we helped out at summer schools. There's in the local community, we became involved in the environment group, which ran this Viable Futures and Environment Fair, and part of the art exhibition for that, we persuaded Janu to come and show his sculptures. So that was successful. I'll skip past that one. That's the full family. But after that, we decided Kathy was on the regional teaching committee, and Kiama was then a goal. It had 6 Baha'is, and so we moved to this house in Kiama when I wanted to start my business. That was in the end of 1991, and we helped form the local assembly here in 1991. And it also was 50% children. And children became something of a feature of the local community. Essentially, the year after we moved in, Kathy and Jill Weesey started doing best classes in the local schools. And that's become a particular strength. 30 years later, they're still running at its peak. We had 140 children from all of the 4 local primary schools. And we've run a lot of other activities. In the early years, we had a local children's choir called the Tree of Life, which performed at a lot of events. And with council assistance, we've run children's activities at Harmony Days and other similar kind of council events. And with our best children, we've run a peace festival at the local school as well, with acts and songs and so on involving the local children. We've also been pretty heavily involved in the local environment movement. We founded a bush food garden, and it was officially opened by the mayor, who's the lady in red, and the opening was also attended by local Aboriginal elder and Bahai Gabu Ted Thomas. And so it was a reasonably high profile event. We had a tree planting and we got media coverage, and many of the people involved in doing the planting, again, children, as you notice, but many of them were not Baha'is. Whilst we had Gabu in town, we took him to the local high school to talk to the children, and to the primary schools as well. This is the community at the time. We also ran a peace festival, and that had a whole range of activities, with probably the most prominent one was the Sea of Hands, which was based on this design by a local Aboriginal artist, this guy, and that's him holding up the design that he used. And so this is it in one of the main parks in Kiama. And another notable activity we ran was a commemorative gathering for the tsunami, raising money to help with the response. And again, we had the mayor in attendance and a local notable Aboriginal person, and the Eddington and Humphries families, of course, neighbours, and even the local member of parliament. So all the children in the community have grown up now and moved away, so we're somewhat smaller than we used to be. But individual members have continued to be involved with best classes continuing even through COVID, ongoing participation in environmental issues. We're part of the local refugee committee and helping council activities for senior citizens and involved with craft groups and so on. We've also developed a model of discussion evenings, which we call Soup and Arts. That's a potluck event which focuses on a typical topical social issue of the day. And we ask people to contribute their own thoughts, and we encourage the use of the arts. So we've had choral music, poetry, performance art, and so on. And we've had sometimes 30 people attending some of these. And for those of you who don't know Kiama, that's it. If you'd like to move down here and support the community, we'd love for you to join us. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Kathryn and Edwin for presenting the story of Kathy's parents and then your own story. I note that takes the family history over 8 decades of involvement in the Australian Bahai community. So thank you for taking that through. I think we've learned so much about the Sales senior and the children. I know that you've got quite a number of children and maybe even grandchildren who are online tonight in this session, but on behalf of everybody in this session, I'd like to thank you very much for the presentation. It's been splendid. Thank you.
Thank you.